One of the telltale signs that a parable originates with the historical Jesus is its subversion of a myth. My culture tends to have a low view of myth, also known as make-believe, and a high view of history, also known as facts. Well, a degree in history disabused me of the latter, and a degree in theology disabused me of the former. Both history and myth are more complex and more nuanced than simple categories of false and true. See, myths are tools to enable a culture to make sense of the world. Some myths I heard growing up were, work hard and you will get ahead. Be prepared. A stitch in time saves 9. And around sayings like these, we create or appropriate stories to reinforce them. So to give you an example, the story of the 3 little pigs and the big bad wolf. It's a mythic story with a moral about preparedness. Remember the pig who made it out of bricks and prepared for the wolf. It's a myth not because it's made up or false story, but because of its moral, which my culture would say is self-evidently true. That is, that preparedness is good. Sometimes, though, particularly in biblical stories, a later editor will attach their own moral to the end of the story. So the later editor hasn't made up the story, but has borrowed it, when acknowledging sources wasn't something that people did, and then put their own interpretation on it, often with a few lines at the end. For example, Matthew and Luke tell the parable of the banquet, from whence we get the "I cannot come to the banquet" song. This is very likely an authentic Jesus parable. It gets a pink rating from the Jesus Seminar. But Luke and Matthew have attached their own conclusions to it, namely a judgment upon those who refuse the invitation to come. We know this, firstly, because we have a version in the Gospel of Thomas without the judgment conclusion. And secondly, we know the idea of judging and even punishing people, like at the end of the Gospel reading from Matthew 13:44 to 52 today. That sort of ending reflects the agenda of some late 1st century Jesus groups, and not Jesus himself. And of course, the parable, in its essence, is focused on welcoming to the table all those excluded from society, not creating a new class of excluded people who need punishing. Now, the myth behind the parable of the banquet is that successful people celebrate success by inviting friends and business associates, usually of the same class, to dinner. And what Jesus was doing in telling this myth was subverting it by saying that in God's empire, successful people celebrate success by inviting all the marginal people, the misfits and miscreants, to their dinner tables. And you can imagine the response of Jesus' audience. You've got to be kidding. You mean we have to sit next to them? Myths are means by how cultures make sense of the world. But cultures, of course, aren't uniform, and most have elites who get a big say in what myths predominate. These myths, in turn, shape the culture and shape it in ways that ultimately favor the elites. But myths can get subverted, thank God, by prophetic storytellers. agitators, heretics. And sometimes the myths can even change. Think of the race relations myth of my childhood in the 60s and 70s. We are one people. To the new myth of today, we are one nation of many peoples. But let's return to the Three Little Pigs. In 1993, Eugene Travas wrote a subversion of it, summarized in the title, The Three Little Wolves and the Big Bad Pig. This amusing rendition not only challenged the categorizing of animals into good and bad, it also challenged what we think a secure house is, and how we deal with one whom we experience as threatening. To spoil the ending for you, the last house was one made of flowers. Flowers that transformed the big bad pig from threat to friend. Well, it's about as realistic as a wolf coming down the chimney, isn't it? Let me tell you another mythic story and the subversion of it. This story was about a Jewish man laying beaten by the side of the road. Two members of religious Jewish elites walked by and didn't stop to help. But then an ordinary Jewish man did. The moral of the story, as everyone knows, particularly those who live in rural Galilee, is that religious elites from the Jerusalem temple might preach mercy but don't practice it. They're hypocrites. But then Jesus came along and told a subversion of the story, where the hero wasn't a Jew at all, but sometimes we Jews, the audience, despised an outsider, a heretic, a Samaritan. And you can imagine the response of his audience. You've got to be kidding. Samaritans are bad and wicked and would never ever help a Jew. Jesus made the audience feel very uncomfortable. So much so that when Luke wrote it down decades later, he changed the moral to being a compassionate neighbor to the beaten man, which was the moral actually of the original myth, not the moral of the Jesus subversion of that myth. Now the gospel text from Matthew 13, 44 to 48, has three little parables. One about treasure and a field, one about a merchant and a pearl, and one about a fish and a net. They read at first glance as little nuggets of common sense wisdom. But then Matthew adds on verses 49 to 51 and makes these parables fit with his late first century goodies versus baddies agenda, with all that angels and fiery furnaces judgment nonsense. But let's go back to those original little parables. To begin with the fish in the net, here's the version from the Gospel of Thomas. The wise fisherman cast his net into the sea and drew it up from the sea full of small fish. Among them the wise fisherman found a fine large fish. He threw all the small fish back into the sea and chose the large fish. This is simply an old wisdom saying, based on the common sense of fisherfolk, motivated by need, not greed, finding the large fish and putting the small fish back for future anglers. In the Thomas tradition, the wise fisherman is the enlightened person who discovers the true value of Jesus' words among all the distractions of the little fish. In the Matthew tradition, the big fish is the truth of Jesus, and the little fish are not only bad words and ideas, they are bad people and need to be disposed of. In terms of myth, neither Thomas nor Matthew have a subversive element in the story that questions the mythic common sense of catching fish. And therefore, the consensus of Jesus seminar scholars is the parable didn't likely originate with Jesus. It gets a black rating. Now, this is not so for the parables of the treasure and the field, and the merchant and the pearl. They get pink ratings. Heaven's imperial rule is like treasure hidden in a field. When someone finds it, that person covers it up and out of sheer joy goes and sells every last possession and buys that field. The mythic framework causes no alarm. There's no noxious mustard here or unclean leaven. Just treasure hidden in a field, which was not an uncommon first century banking practice. And the myth, as articulated in the book of Proverbs, is about diligently searching before being rewarded with a find. Seek and ye shall find. Good common sense wisdom. But there is a problem that even some modern day commentators choose to overlook or simplify. This is the problem of who owns the field, and therefore who owns the treasure. The person who found the treasure did not own the field. Was it finders keepers? Poachers love that saying. First century legal opinion said, find a coin on a public road, sure, keep it. But find coins on someone else's land, no, that is not yours. The hidden treasure, which, as in the myth, should be a reward for good deeds, seduces the finder in their euphoric joy into a course of action that has an immoral and illegal outcome. They basically steal someone else's property. So it's a parable subverting the seeking treasure myth. And its message is actually a warning. Be careful about what treasure you are seeking and the means you are using to acquire it. The acquiring of riches is not an ultimate good. This morning I shared two little Anthony de Mello parables on the theme of wealth. About one man with one shoe who is grateful for finding this one shoe, while his companion who sees him with one shoe thinks he's suffering the loss of a shoe. And it's a clever little story about attitude and gratitude and contentment, something the treasure hunter in our parable might have profited from. And the other little de Mello parable is subversive of the myth about doing a good, thorough and complete job and then receiving a reward for it. This was about a girl who mowed the lawns for her father, and she left a patch in the middle, and she wouldn't, the father said, well, I'm not going to pay you unless you mow at all. And she wouldn't mow this little patch, and then he went out and found a frog in this little patch. And the message of this parable is that compassion and kindness are more important than either the monetary reward or even the approval of her father and employer. The last parable today in the Matthew reading is also subversive of the treasure-seeking myth. Again, the empire of God is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, the myth behind this story is about total dedication and sacrifice to gain what you really want, the pearl of great price. Merchant was a class of the wealthy, and therefore he or she had to give up a lot. And Matthew, Thomas, and other commentators concur with this myth and interpret this story as giving up false riches, false ideas and ideologies in order to follow the truth of Jesus. But again, there's a problem here. The merchant has sold all. All is not hyperbole. So now he or she, the merchant, has no means to live. They are broke, and there's no government benefit. If you want to buy the pearl, you've sold off all capital. They will then have to sell the pearl or else be destitute, starve and die. Thus, the thing of value, the pearl, has no ultimate value. So the message of this merchant and pearl parable is subversive. It says that ultimately the kingdom of God, the empire of God, is of no value. What you give up all to possess, it has no monetary value. And if you treat the whole parable as an allegory about spiritual riches, the same holds true. You gave up privileges and pastimes to gain a spiritual wealth that has no bargaining value. It can't be traded for spiritual rewards. It can't get you a favoured seat in the afterlife. It won't make you an influencer with God. And you can imagine the response of Jesus' audience. You've got to be kidding. What's in it for me? Well, nothing. The empire of God, the vision of Jesus, is about love. Mercy, justice, compassion, hospitality, that sort of love. And love is more about giving up than gaining. More about loss than profit, more about including the dubious, the immoral, the failures, and those who care for them. It's not about gain and rewards. Matthew made Jesus' vision into a myth of winners triumphing over losers. But the historical Jesus didn't fit into that myth. His parables, when parted from that interpretive overlay put on by Matthew 50 years later, historical Jesus subverted that winners versus losers myth and instead made room for losers and changed the whole understanding of winning in the process. Blessings to you this week.